Welcome to Vandy Football Insider. I'm Dave Ammenheuser, the sports editor of the Tennessean. With me today are Jeff Lockridge, our beat writer here at the Tennessean on Vandy Football, and Barton Simmons from 247sports.com, a recruiting expert. We're here today to talk about Vanderbilt football and where it is in its recruiting and what's happened since James Franklin left and Derek Mason came in. So guys, let's get to it. We've got a lot to talk about today. Jeff, I'll start with you. When James Franklin left a little over 2 weeks ago, recruiting kind of started this recruiting less, I guess, started to snowball. Where are we today with the Vanderbilt football recruiting?
Well, snowball in this circumstance is probably an understatement. When James left, of course, this late in the process and this close to signing day, this recruiting class, as we knew it, kind of dissipated, went from 20 public recruits, or 20 public commitments, all the way down to 8. It's now bumped back up to 10, but less than half of what it used to be. A lot of the guys that left were some of their better prospects. They're four-star kind of guys, and Barton can probably speak to that. But at this point, Coach Mason's job in such a short period of time is to get in front of as many kids' faces as he can, in as many living rooms, as many high schools as he can. Try to shore up the recruits that remain on board, which I think he did a pretty good job of this past weekend with the official visits. This coming weekend is going to be more about adding to that number 10. Last week hit Georgia, hit Florida. This week I think he's starting out west, maybe hit California, Texas, Mississippi, come on back into Tennessee, and just try to boost that number. And you know, you don't want to have 10 when it comes next Wednesday. You like for that number to be a little bit higher.
Right. Barton, Tennessean columnist Dave Clymer likes to call James Franklin Coach Poach. And he may not be the first. I've heard it on radio. You may have used it yourself. I don't know. But have you ever seen anything like this while you've been? Yeah,
well, you know, every year when a coach leaves and gets a new job, there's going to be some poaching. You look at what Steve Sarkisian has done at USC. He's taken a couple Washington commits with him. Chris Peterson at Washington has taken a few Boise State commits with him. I think when you look at what's happened with Vanderbilt, it's kind of been a perfect storm, though, because the timing of the move. This was after signing day. It's a shorter January for recruiting as it is, with one less official visit weekend. There was an extended dead period this year. So there's only a couple official visit weekends he had to work with. James Franklin had a week where he was deciding whether to leave or stay at Vanderbilt. So that created uncertainty. There was another week where Vanderbilt took to hire Derek Mason. So that's another week where recruits don't know what's going on. And then we've almost had another week after that getting those assistant coaches through the HR process and the hiring process. So again, Derek Mason is basically recruiting with a one-man staff with Charles Bankins on board, trying to get in these living rooms. And so all those things combined, I think, have really created a perfect scenario for James Franklin to really come down and poach this class the way it has.
And he's poached how many at this point?
He's taken five. Five have decommitted from Vanderbilt and committed to Penn State. And then as Jeff mentioned, 12 all combined had decommitted at one point. So, but I think that, you know, things have settled a little bit, and now Derek Mason's kind of got a fighting chance down the home stretch.
Can he salvage the recruiting class, Jeff? What would
Probably
make it salvageable?
Depends on your definition of salvage. From a talent standpoint, the guys that they still have on board are pretty good. Certainly one area, if we're talking about positions, that he's going to salvage is the secondary. I think 6 of the 10 commitments they have on board are DBs, and some of them are pretty solid DBs, and not just your run-of-the-mill 5'9", 160 guys. They've got some bigger 6 foot, 200-pound kids in this group, and I think that group in particular took to this past weekend of official visits and kind of bonded, and they kind of see themselves as a unit already going forward. So in terms of salvaging that area, sure. In terms of salvaging a number, that remains to be seen. You'd love to see that number creep back up there, 14, 15, 16 if possible. I think the staff maybe has their eyes on a bigger number, but you've got to make sure that you don't start reaching and take flyers on kids.
Well, that was probably my next question. Barton, what makes more sense, to get 10, 12 really solid kids, or does it make more sense to stock your roster and have 20 signees, even though some of them may only ever play second string? Or what makes more sense?
Yeah, you know, I think you're going to see Derek Mason go with the approach of we're going to find the right guys. And I don't think, I mean, you even look at some of the guys that were taken from the original 20 that were committed. Derek Mason, frankly, didn't fight very hard to get a couple of those guys back. And I think it was just because they didn't fit what they were trying to do. And so this isn't a class where they're just trying to get numbers. They're not going to just try to get 18 commitments no matter who they are. They've evaluated the roster. They've evaluated the previous commitment list. They've evaluated their current targets. And they've sort of reassessed and taken a new approach to try to make sure that moving forward, they've got the right guys on the roster. So I think you may see a commitment list that ends up with 15, 16 guys if they close strong. But I don't think you're going to see them just take kids just to get to that 20 or 18 number. They want guys that fit what Derek Mason's trying to do.
And just to piggyback on Barton's point, if you leave some scholarships available, you allow yourself to have a bigger signing class next year with the 2015 group, because it's a pretty small senior class for Vanderbilt this coming year, and they would not, under normal circumstances, they sign a full class this year, they would not be able to sign a full class next year. So that gives them the opportunity to go out and sign possibly a full class next year.
And not to mention, next year's another really strong year in-state where Vanderbilt's got a few ties to some in-state kids that are pretty good. So they've got an opportunity to have a really strong 2015.
Okay. Well, let's take a quick break. We'll come back and talk about the recruiting class of 2014 and who we could possibly see sign here next week.
We're social beings. We have the desire to connect. But you only have so much time to catch our attention. Interact with us where we are. Engage with us the way we like to engage. Be a part of our lifestyle. Put your business where your customers are. Learn more at tnmedia.com. Everywhere your business wants to be.
Welcome back to Vandy Football Insider. I'm Dave Ammenheuser, the sports editor of the Tennessean. With me today are Jeff Lockridge, our Tennessean beat writer, and Barton Simmons from 247sports.com. He's our recruiting expert joining us today. Guys, let's talk a little bit more about Vandy football. Barton, are there any names on that list of 10 that they've already got that could make an impact immediately next year?
Well, I mean, I think there's several. And frankly, Jeff talked about how big this defensive back group is. And they're going to need some of those guys to contribute right away, particularly at the safety position. Two guys I'll mention. One guy's Kyle Gibson, who is a kid that they're really fighting to keep on board because UCF is coming strong, so he's one to watch down the stretch. He's a defensive back out of Tampa, and he could be a corner. I mean, frankly, for Derek Mason, because of his size and length, he may be a corner in their defense. Some have recruited him at safety. But he is important to keep on board because he's one of the most highly rated guys. He is the most highly rated kid for 247 Sports as far as the guys they've got committed. And then one other guy to keep in mind is a kid named Jesse Burkett, offensive lineman, also out of Florida. Really talented kid. Again, I mentioned some of the guys that I think the Derek Mason staff wasn't that thrilled about that were already committed when he first got the job. This is not one of those guys. Stanford wanted him, really talented football player, and we'd all know the emphasis Stanford puts on those offensive linemen. I think you're going to see that same sort of emphasis trying to make that a glamour position at Vanderbilt, and Burkett, it would be a great building block.
Okay. Jeff, can you talk about the lone remaining mid-state recruit, Emmanuel Smith, right?
Yeah, Emmanuel's a good one, and we talked about the size of some of these defensive backs. Well, he's got size. I believe he's 6'2" and over 200 pounds now. Obviously, he showed a ton of talent in high school. They like his body size on the back end of that defense, and he could also be a guy that factors into the equation early. You look at the secondary and the way it's set up with the guys they've got coming back. They lose all 4 starters. Kenny Ladler's a huge loss at free safety, but you've got Andrew Williamson, you've got Jamel McIntosh, you've got some guys who have some reps in there, but in terms of depth, and you got to have that depth, especially when you go to your nickel and dime packages. Some of these freshmen are probably going to have to get on the field, and Emmanuel, with his body size, if he can have a good fall camp, would certainly be a candidate. Another key aspect to his recruitment, of course, is his younger brother Josh, who will be a rising senior at Oakland High School, and somebody else Vanderbilt would like to get on board eventually.
Where does he play?
He's a linebacker and a good one, and as Barton told me, potential maybe with his body size to move into a defensive end spot.
Okay. Question for both of you guys is: are there any left remaining mid-state guys out there who haven't signed that Vandy could possibly take a look at?
Well, I mean, I think one guy to mention is Bruno Reagan at Clarksville, and Vanderbilt's previous coaching staff was aware of him. They had recruited him a little bit, and he had camped at Vanderbilt over the summer. He's committed to USF, and that's the staff that was previously at Western Kentucky. So that's kind of where that connection came from. They really liked him when they were at Western Kentucky under Willie Taggart. Now at USF, they recruited him down there. And frankly, I think he'd be a pretty nice little late steal. He's probably going to visit this weekend officially. This is a kid that's a state champion wrestler. He is a world-renowned judo wrestler. So he's got an interesting background. Didn't start playing football till he was a sophomore. A lot of athleticism. So he's one of those sort of late sleeper type guys that Vandy's in on. And certainly is sort of a guy to watch here down the home stretch.
Most of those judo moves are illegal. You can't get penalized for that. But Barton may be a little bit too young to remember. Although you've got your NBA connections, you probably remember another state champion wrestler that I would have covered back when he was in high school, pretty good offensive lineman named Scott Wells at Brentwood Academy.
No doubt.
Who's given quite a few snaps over the years to Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers. So, a good track record of wrestlers going on to do good things.
So when they bring Bruno in this weekend, and
if he visits,
I mean, how does Vanderbilt go about recruiting these kids? Explain that to maybe some people watching who don't really understand the whole recruiting process. They bring him in, they just say, hey, look at the campus, or do they have like a very structured schedule for these guys when they come in?
Well, I'll say this. I think one of the real emphasis of this Vanderbilt recruiting official visits over this last weekend and next weekend is not as much, showing the bells and whistles and jump through a bunch of hoops for these guys, but more just sitting down with the coaching staff, with the current players, building relationships, because this is a coaching staff. The assistant coaches, Carl Durrell came from the NFL. Brett Maxey, the defensive back coach, came from the NFL. Coach Thompson from the outside linebackers coach came from San Jose State. I mean, they're recruiting guys that they don't have relationships with yet. So I think the most important thing for these assistants and for the staff right now is to just sit down with these guys and really make them comfortable with the situation, and they'll be eating a lot of food too.
That's right. Normal official visit this time of year. The coaching staff has had a long-standing relationship with the kids, so you're not having to work on that. You're taking them around campus, and Vandy in past years would use this weekend to go meet the dean of the department, in which the kid wants to major, and started establishing some academic relationships. Let them spend more time with their future teammates. But like you said, right now it's about figuring out what position they would play and getting them comfortable with the coaches that are on staff.
Great. All right, we'll be right back and talk a little bit more about last year's recruiting class and whether any of those guys can make an impact on Vanderbilt this fall.
We're social beings. We have the desire to connect. But you only have so much time to catch our attention. Interact with us where we are. Engage with us the way we like to engage. Be a part of our lifestyle. Put your business where your customers are. Learn more at tnmedia.com. Everywhere your business.
Welcome back to Vandy Football Insider. I'm Dave Ammenheuser, the sports editor of the Tennessean. With me today is Jeff Lockridge, our beat writer here at the Tennessean, and Barton Simmons, joining us today from 247sports.com. He's a recruiting expert, and he's giving us his input on Vanderbilt's recruiting this season. Guys, let's talk a little bit about last year's recruiting class, back to 2013. I know James Franklin redshirted a lot of guys.
Right.
Now, one thing I haven't seen written anywhere or out in the media too much is a lot's been written. Let me back up. A lot's been written about the guys who were going to leave that were committed this year and left. But what about those guys who still haven't even played it down at Vanderbilt? Is there any chance those redshirt freshmen last year could jump ship?
Well, I think there's always that possibility, but I think the reason you haven't seen much written, and maybe you're hinting at me to get another story out, I don't know. But maybe the reason we haven't heard that much is because I think most of these guys are on board and still happy with the first year that they had at Vanderbilt and the opportunity to stay and get some playing time in the near future. It's a pretty good bunch. Like Dave said, the vast majority redshirted. You had a few get on the field, Darius Sims and Jordan Cunningham by necessity at certain positions. But I haven't heard many rumblings, Barton, about kids that are wanting out. I think most of these kids, once they've met Mason and had their nerves settled a little bit, are more than willing to stay.
No, I haven't either. I haven't heard those rumblings. I mean, Derek Mason's got a great track record, and I think still, in-house, they're still sort of getting comfortable with the coaching staff and meeting the coaching staff and learning about what's to come. And right now, I think Vanderbilt got their guy that they wanted, and there's no reason to think there's not some confidence within the team. In fact, there's been a lot of positive social media and tweets of that regard from players that seem pretty optimistic about what's to come.
The one guy in that group, Dave, that they could ill afford, especially at this point in their commitment class, to lose would be Johnny McCrary. They're already thin at quarterback. They've got Patton Robinette. Josh Grady's coming off a knee injury. Johnny's the other kid and a dual threat guy who had a big high school career down in Georgia, and a lot of people see him as sort of the future at that position. You occasionally see a message board post, oh, is Johnny happy? Is he thinking about leaving? But based on the way that Derek talked in his introductory press conference, I think he's got plans for McCrary down the road too. And I think as long as they keep him happy and have a plan for him, then they're in decent shape there.
Okay. Barton, talk a little bit about Derek Mason's job as far as recruiter. How does that stack up recruiting here now in the SEC when he had been out in the Pac-12? I mean, what differences do you think you'll see, or is it more challenging in this market, or are you just selling the institution like he was at Stanford?
I do think it's a significantly bigger challenge for him than what he had at Stanford, because at Stanford, you really are kind of the Ivy League of college football, and you can just throw that S up there, and any kid that's a high academic kid is going to respond to that. And particularly on the West Coast, where kids, that draw to a certain program isn't quite as strong as maybe SEC country. A high academic kid that was raised an Auburn fan is still going to want to go to Auburn. and that's nothing against Auburn's academics, but that's just the way Southeastern kids were raised. They're not going to be looking for a Vanderbilt or a Stanford necessarily. So I think that's a challenge. That's a new challenge. And I think, frankly, on the West Coast, recruiting, the pace is a little bit slower as far as when those offers go out, when those commitments start happening. In the Southeast and SEC, it's a very different environment with regard to just when those offers go out, the competitive nature of the recruiting trail. And I think he's prepared for that. He's recruiting in the Southeast. They've won some big battles at Stanford to land some elite prospects. There's no doubt about that. But again, I just think that there's going to be he's going to have to sort of prove himself that he's up for this SEC task here. I do think you're going to see a very different approach than James Franklin, who was anxious to get the highly rated classes, get the kids with a lot of major offers, get kids with stars next to their name. I don't think Derek Mason cares about that. I think that he is very content trusting his evaluation, whether the kid's got a 2-star next to his name and no offers, or whether he's a 5-star kid. And that's just a different approach to the staff. And, it may not make some of my readers happy at 24/7 Sports, but I think it's a process that's really had a lot of success at Stanford.
Well, another guy that didn't really care about that was Bobby Johnson at Vanderbilt, and while his overall record doesn't speak to the record Derek Mason would like to have at Vanderbilt, he didn't leave the cupboard bare.
Yeah.
He had some good 2- and 3-star kids, Jordan Matthews, Zach Stacy, Wesley Johnson, Casey Hayward, plenty of guys that kind of flew under the radar in the recruiting process that he brought in and helped James Franklin win a lot of ball games.
Okay. All right, gentlemen, thank you. Actually, I have one last question for Barton. I want to show you a photo, Barton. Can you tell me if this college football player would have ever been recruited by by Vanderbilt, number 3 there, guys. That's Barton in, what, about 2002?
Yeah, that's right. That's well, interesting story here. I actually turned down a scholarship offer from Vanderbilt. Had a gray shirt offer under Woody Woodenhofer. Dennis Harrison was my recruiter, but I chose the Ivy League. If Derek Mason or James Franklin were in my living room, that would have been tougher to turn down.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it very much. And maybe we get back together and talk about this stuff again, maybe right before the spring game. That would be great.
Be awesome.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks a lot. It's Dave Ammenheuser, the sports editor of the Tennessean, joined by Jeff Lockridge, our beat writer here at the Tennessean, and a special thank you to Barton Simmons from 247sports.com joining us today. Thanks a bunch, guys.
Thanks.